Welcome back to your Silicon Bites Daily Geopolitics brief with a rundown of news stories on the 15th of October 2025. We cover Ukraine, Russia, China, and the global struggle against autocracy. We start with a moment of extraordinary weakness, a comment that could act as a red rag to a bull as far as Putin is concerned, because he is provoked to aggression by weakness, not by strength and pushback. Mark Rutte claims that the shooting down of a Russian jet breaching Allied airspace would be a sign of weakness. Cue a storm of criticism from Ukrainians and Eastern Europeans who actually live under the flight paths of Russian drones and missiles. We also examine Russia's latest winter strikes on Ukraine's grid. Kyiv hits back deep inside Russia. Poland warns Europe to prepare for deep Russian attacks on European territory. And NATO scrambles for fresh air defences as the aid to Ukraine dips. Let's jump into today's stories. The first one, Mark Rutte's strength through restraint. Is this mixed signals or is it signalling fatal weakness? NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte told reporters that automatic shootdowns of Russian jets violating Allied airspace would project weakness, not strength. For those who have not seen the clip, he said this with a sincere and straight face. He really did. This comes just hours after he mocked a Russian nuclear submarine for breaking down and having to limp back to its base. So when one day he managed to both goad Russia and signal submission to its threats at the same time. As he put it, we are much stronger than the Russians. We shouldn't shoot down Russian planes just because they enter our airspace. If we were weak, you might think, all right, we're weak, so we must immediately show them that when they enter our airspace, we shoot them down. These are remarks he made that are re-reported by NV, the New Voice of Ukraine, in English, October 15th. Ukrainian and Eastern European commentators pounced on these comments. Ukraine's former Interior Ministry advisor, Anton Gerashenko, amplified the quote and the incredulity that it sparked, while Baltic and Polish voices argued that Moscow reads hesitation as a green light to keep probing. This is from various social roundups and reactions on X, formerly Twitter. But I'm sorry, I'm going to have to put my opinion into this as well. But this level of clownish unprofessionalism by Rutte is going to get Europe invaded. Rutte is a clownish fool, strategically inept, and yet has the hubris of a privileged technocrat who does not even begin to understand what he does not understand. We appointed a bureaucrat who enjoys playing to the gallery, throwing out quips, yet on action he dawdles and delays in a time of deep crisis when what we actually need is visionary leadership, strategy, strong will and imagination. Rutte, quite clearly from his words and lack of actions, possesses none of these attributes. We should also reference the incident in 2015 when Turkey, the Turkish Air Force, shot down a Russian Su-24 attack aircraft near the Syrian border. Turkey said the aircraft had violated its airspace, while Russia disputed the claim. Of course, it disputes all claims in such circumstances. The incident sparked a major diplomatic confrontation, but it did not lead to a wider conflict, and relations later improved. Russia tested boundaries. Turkey showed that borders and boundaries were real, and such an incursion has not been repeated since in Turkish airspace. This is strength through enforcing red lines. Academic Michael Williams from Syracuse University, commenting recently on the broader pattern of incursions, warned that Putin is testing how resolutely NATO reacts and whether weaknesses are emerging. He called it a dangerous escalation. That's from October 2nd. And in London, Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski urged Europe to prepare for deep strike attacks by Russia and to beef up a drone wall on the eastern flank. This is a politely pointed rebuttal to any hint of passivity from NATO. That's reported by Reuters on October 15th. We will come back to that comment in a minute because I think it is incredibly important. Rutte's intent may have been to signal discipline and proportionality, But the way that his soundbite landed was more like strength through weakness. In a hybrid war of drone incursions and sabotage, messaging such weakness to an enemy that is so relentless as Russia is extremely dangerous. Story 2. Mass Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy grid. The winter playbook returns. We touched upon this yesterday, and here are some more details. Over the weekend into October 10th, Russia launched a large-scale attack on Ukraine's energy sector. These attacks are continuing and are clearly part of an orchestrated pattern. Power cuts hit Kyiv and multiple regions. Hundreds of thousands briefly lost electricity before crews restored supply. Reuters notes the sequencing and the rapid repairs that Ukraine is able to implement. That isn't the whole story, though. President Zelensky said Russia waited for bad weather to degrade air defenses before striking. But the consequences of those strikes are still being felt. Kyiv and other cities still have intermittent power in some districts, and heating is off in others. Expect recurring waves of drones designed to exhaust the interceptor stocks, wreck power transformers, and sap Ukrainian morale. It's the fourth winter of Russia's energy war, and this winter promises to be harsher than both the winters of 24 and 23, not just in terms of the weather, but also in terms of the determined strikes against this kind of infrastructure, against the determination of Russia to make the lives of Ukrainian civilians an absolute misery. The only exception here is that this time Ukraine can strike back on Russian territory too. Well, story 3, the slide in military supplies to Ukraine. Collectively, Europe is dropping the ball. As the rhetoric of supporting Ukraine intensifies, assistance on the ground, Western military support for Ukraine is experiencing a wobble. Supplies are down compared to 2024 and early 2025, and NATO is hunting for air defences to gift Ukraine and more cash for weapons. NATO defence ministers are meeting in Brussels to reverse a slide in aid. Deliveries dipped sharply in July and August. Ministers are pushing the Pearl mechanism, that is, prioritised Ukraine requirements list and fresh air defence packages as Russian attacks on Ukraine intensify. That's in AP News. Even with Denmark, the Netherlands and Sweden buying US kit for Ukraine under Pearl, there are still many gaps that persist, and Moscow is betting that a harsh winter, plus fatigue amongst the allies, their public, their media and politicians, that Russia will be able to outlast Western resolve. They're counting on attrition on all fronts, including the psychological and informational ones. Various theories have been put forward as to why Europe is hesitant beyond just political and voter apathy. We'll examine this in a standalone episode, but one theory is that Europe is still waiting for the normalization of the US stance towards the war, towards international relations, towards its partners, a return to the fold, renewed military aid support for Ukraine, as if these were normal times. But this is not going to happen. Story 5. Hybrid pressure on Europe drones airspace hesitation. A spate of drone incidents over airports and energy sites, Germany, Denmark, Poland, plus fighter jet provocations has European governments on edge. The Guardian captured the broader psychology. The fear effect is part of the point. It's destabilization by implied kinetic ingression with a clear path to escalation while aiming to maintain strategic ambiguity. It can be summarized as, you know we did it, and we know you know we did it, and you know that we know that you know we did it, and yet we still won't admit to it. This is where Rutte's words sting. Deterrence needs sharp and clear-cut rules of engagement and consistent messaging. It needs strong credibility that red lines will be enforced, threats acted upon, and that we have the will and capacity to defend our sovereign space and sovereign interests. Rutte resorting to a mix of verbal bravado, mockery, institutional platitudes, and rhetoric clearly aimed at self-reassurance rather than deterrence will only be interpreted by Moscow one way: that we have neither the capacity nor the will to oppose Russian aggression, and therefore they have a green light to proceed to the next level of intimidation and threat. and that could possibly be military. Our response is verbal rather than in actions, and this risks making the incursions become the new normal. We invite the next test from Russia. Words are weakness. NATO and Rutte seem oblivious to the psychological state of the Russian regime and the stance that is required on our part to counter it. The next story, markets and budgets in Moscow. The war bill comes due. Inside Russia, strains are peeking through. The Moscow Times reported the sharpest one-day stock slide in 3 years. On October 8th, days earlier, the World Bank clipped 2025 growth projections, its outlook, to 0.9%. And analysts labelled the 2026 draft budget as more taxes for more war. Now we turn back to the story about Sikorsky and Poland. Story 6, Poland's warning shot, plan for the worst and quickly. Back in London, and the message of Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorsky was blunt. Europe should assume Moscow can strike deep and build layered air defences accordingly. From SHORAD to long range plus a drone wall, he also pressed Washington for Tomahawks if Russia keeps hammering Ukraine's grid. That was reported in Reuters. There is an implied criticism here to counterbalance Rutte's stance of extreme weakness. If we aren't prepared to defend against Russian attacks, then we invite that attack. We make them more likely. Poland may conclude that continued hesitation among allies make Russian kinetic attacks almost inevitable sooner or later, and that it's best to prepare for that eventuality now. Well, let's round up this episode by asking, what should we be watching out for next? Well, firstly, there are the rules of engagement clarity from NATO on incursions. Will capitals align their messaging after Rutte's remarks, and will they move to a strength through action doctrine rather than issuing more words yet doing nothing, which exudes weakness? And that's how Russia will interpret it. 2, air defence resupply announcements out of Brussels. We should await more Pearl orders, transformer stocks and equipment to help Ukraine repair its energy grid, and possibly new munitions and capabilities for Ukraine. We also need clarity on the procurement programme for artillery ammunition following the recent election in Czechia and the implied threat that this highly successful programme will lose momentum. And finally, we should watch out for deep strikes in Russia's rear, especially on refineries and depots, which seem to be ongoing daily. This will be an indication of whether Kyiv can keep shaping the winter battlefield and take the energy war to the enemy's lands, imposing a real cost on Putin's regime and curtailing the effectiveness of Russia's war machine. That's from The Guardian. Well, that's today's roundup on 15th October 2025, day 1340 of Putin's illegal war.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!